Talking about accessibility.
Go to a government site, hearing impairment.
Welcome to another episode of Cup of Joe. Today we have Salim Darcy, our head of websites, joining us. And we have a venti cup of Joe today, something that is kind of hot, and if you're not careful, will scald you. We're talking about accessibility, WCAG guidelines, and the ADA. Sal, thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me.
All right, so to start us off, can you just give us a brief overview of what accessibility is?
Yeah, so I think we see accessibility all the time, especially in our day-to-day world. Best examples that I always use is the handicap parking spots, the wheelchair ramps, or even the braille you see on like elevator doors.
Sure.
Those are very tangible examples of accessibility. And I think the root of it is creating an open and inclusive world to all walks of life.
Right.
For us in the digital world, it's a bit less clear, it's a bit less gray. We're taking something that's very tangible and putting in the digital world where it's a lot harder to see and the nuances are a lot more gray.
Sure.
Yeah.
So can you provide a brief overview of the ADA and how it relates to digital accessibility?
Yep. So ADA is the Americans with Disabilities Act. So a lot of it is taking that grayness and creating rules and guidelines for companies and organizations to follow. With it still being gray, they have minimum expectations to hit.
Sure.
And it's kind of based on the organization on how far they push it.
Okay, cool. Can you give us a little bit about what the WCAG is, the Website Content Accessibility Guidelines?
Yeah, so WCAG is Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. And the intention for that is very similar to ADA, but a little bit more broader, maybe a little bit more all-encompassing. It has very specific rules to follow. The best example that I always use for this is if you go to a government site, it's always that white background with black text.
Sure.
Is because they have to follow the most extreme requirements of accessibility. Us being in a medical industry, we don't have to go to that extreme, but we are governed by law to reach a certain level of compliance.
Okay, very cool. And when we're taking a look at what the governing bodies are doing and things like that, are there specific widgets or plugins or things like that that you normally see when it comes to accessibility?
So from my experience and from my perspective, the best way to handle accessibility is from the roots.
Okay.
So it's it should be ingrained within the product. There are definitely processes and nuances to know and understand to minimize negative impacts.
Sure.
But we don't really lean on plugins or widgets. We ingrain it into our product. So it provides more of an all-encompassing experience. Some of the things that we do is create our websites with the ability for screen readers to navigate it.
Okay.
We are constantly checking the contrast between colors to make sure that when they sit on top of each other, they are not leading to any of that overlap between color blindness, but also enough contrast where you can still read and navigate the content that is on the site. Those are some of the examples that we do.
Very cool.
Yeah.
So let's talk about the key principles of the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines a little bit. How do the WCAG guidelines evolve, and what are the key changes in the latest version?
Yeah, so the thing with accessibility is that it's always changing, right? So we live in a digital world where technology is ever evolving. The world as we view it is constantly changing. So the key principles is in the essence of being human first. So we kind of go through life seeing or attacking problems on how our life experiences or our version of life has come our way. But accessibility is kind of flipping that narrative, kind of doing a 180 where it's looking at how other users and how people from different life experiences, how their experiences might change.
Very, very cool.
Yeah.
So let's talk about the ADA compliance just for a second.
Sure.
So what are the legal implications of not being compliant?
Yeah, so sometimes it's a warning, right? So it's, hey, I was trying to use your site. couldn't use X, Y, Z. And it's kind of letting you know, like, we need to hit a certain level of compliance.
Sure.
I think if it ever like escalates beyond that, it could come to fines, and it's usually like in the tens of thousands per infraction.
Wow.
Yeah, so it's definitely important for us to be on top of it. But I think a perspective worth knowing and having is most companies and people are trying to make sure that you are doing the best that you can. So accessibility doesn't ever end.
Right.
Similar to user experience, like it could always be better, it could always be worked on. And it's kind of, are you doing what you can to make sure we are hitting those boundaries?
I like that you just hit on user experience. So let's chat about that for
Sure.
a second. So how can accessibility help the end user experience?
Yeah, so they're kind of one of those things where they're similar but different,
Right.
right? So they have a ton of overlap, and the way that we like to approach it is, if you focus time and energy into accessibility, you will increase the general user experience of the site. And the reason for that is when we're coming from an empathetic and inclusive perspective, all walks of life are included in how we can approach accessibility.
Sure.
User experience is very similar, right? We're coming from a user-centered perspective. I think the other one is a human-centered perspective. Some examples could be if we're focusing on, how users navigate the site, where things live, how things show up.
Sure.
All those play a part in accessibility, and they also play a part in user experience, right? So it's taking a lot of small, subtle changes, and in the aggregate, it has a very large impact.
Okay, very cool. Let's talk about common misconceptions about digital accessibility. What have you encountered?
From my perspective, the main thing that I've seen is that it can be solved by adding a plugin or a software or program to your site. Kind of based on to what I said earlier, it kind of needs to be built with intentionality.
Yeah.
The reason those plugins or programs don't work as well is a lot of accessibility is human focused, which means that it's not black and white. It can't be said whether it's done or isn't done.
Sure.
It needs a human to verify. It needs a human to check it. And a lot of these plugins and programs kind of abstract that, where it's like, add this and I'll do it for you.
Right.
Doesn't really work that way. It could get you a part of the way there, but not past that milestone.
So one thing that I've kind of noticed, and something that I believe that some of our clients have, let's call it challenges with, are a lot of third-party plugins, third-party widgets, whatever you want to call those, that they end up, I guess, purchasing or something along those lines. What, in your experience, what can be done from the agency perspective and what can be done from the client's perspective to ensure that they're, making their stuff as accessible as possible? Yeah.
So I think the main thing is be curious. Like if you work with different vendors or marketing agencies, ensure that they are meeting the level of compliance. And a lot of that it just starts with asking the question, right? So what are you doing to make sure we're hitting those ADA, WACG compliances? In terms of the plugins, like I think they serve a purpose. I don't think they solve the problem, which is kind of my perspective on it.
Yeah.
They do provide a lot of comfort either for the client or for the users, right? Where it's a symbol showing that we are making efforts, even if the true work of accessibility is done in the background, in the back end, in the root of the product.
Very cool.
Yeah.
I guess let's go into testing and assessments. Like what types of tools do you recommend for testing your site or assessing your site?
Yeah, so there's quite a few out there. I think the main one that we use almost religiously is wave.webaim.org.
Okay.
It's a bit more technical. So if you ever load your site through there, it'll show you a lot of things, and it might be hard to navigate and understand all the nuances of it. But the one thing I like about it is that it's very robust, and they're constantly keeping up with the changes to WCAG and ADA. And it also tells you things that you are definitely not doing. It tells you warnings of things that might be something worth looking at, but it's not saying it's an issue. That's kind of like that human perspective on it. where a computer can't tell whether you're doing it or not and needs you to verify and validate. And also tells you the things you're doing right. So it kind of double downs on the efforts.
Very cool. Very cool.
Yeah.
To our viewers, wave.webaim.org will be a link in the comments. How often should organizations conduct accessibility assessments?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think it's an interesting question also, because I think it's less about the frequency that we check and more about the intentionality and how we approach it. I think it never hurts to run your site through a check. And as sites live, they tend to degrade a little bit. Like, I think that's just the truth. But I can share an example on how we approach it, where we have a dedicated team that's responsible for working with their clients to maintain the changes and updates on sites. And a lot of their training and knowledge is with accessibility at the back of their mind. So they're leading with intentionality. So when one of our clients comes to us and would like to make a change, we first think, does this meet the minimum expectations?
Sure.
Does it create negative experiences? And if those two things aren't true, it's like, does it make sense for the strategy that we're trying to put forward? And if all those things are correct, then it makes sense. Obviously, sometimes those compete with each other at times a little bit. So it's finding the best path forward. But to go back to answer your question, I think it's more about leading with intentionality and having in the back of your brain on how other users or other people could experience or navigate through the site, rather than how continuously we run checks and audits.
Sure. I want to bring you back to something that you said a couple of minutes ago. You'd mentioned the fact that sites degrade over time. Can you explain a little bit more about what you meant by that?
Sure. So the way that I see it is like kind of getting a new car, right? So when you go to a dealership, you drive it off the lot, it's pristine, it's perfect, it's as shiny as ever.
Sure.
But as time goes on, technology changes, stakeholders change, strategies change, and kind of how all those things couple together, the outcome of it can show on the site, right? So especially when we're moving between organizations, people might have different levels of standards, compliance, things like that. So it's hard to get rid of, but it's worth acknowledging.
Cool.
Yeah.
So I like that. So it kind of speaks to, the fact that there are going to be internal and external assets of degrading that site. The external being perhaps an algorithm update or, a new rollout from WCAG or et cetera, et cetera. Yeah. And internal being, let's take a look at the website, rebuild some structure aspects, add different plugins, different components like that are happening from the community perspective. Correct. Am I understanding that correctly?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Okay, so let's talk about some challenges. So what are some challenges organizations face when trying to make their digital content accessible?
Yeah, so I think a lot of it is navigating the grayness. So there's a lot of governing bodies with a lot of thoughts, a lot of opinions. Some we definitely have to follow. Some might be almost like conjecture, kind of like things that we could or couldn't do.
Sure.
The main thing that I see a lot of the time is trying to solve it with the press of a button. Okay. And I don't think that's how accessibility works. Kind of going back to the human aspect of it, it's like there needs to be intentionality, there needs to be purpose, there needs to be a reason and a strategy around it.
Sure.
And I think if we just try to put something on top to mask and give it like a facade of accessibility, it doesn't always work.
Okay. Yeah. One thing I keep hearing you say over and over again is curiosity. And I love curiosity. I love that that's kind of a driving force. With obviously the fact that there are, guidelines to be followed strictly. Yeah. And then it's like, now here's your chance to be better. It's always being on the forefront and trying to make sure that no matter who comes through to the website, they're getting the best possible experience.
Yeah.
So let's talk a little bit about design for a sec.
Yeah.
Inclusive design. How can organizations incorporate inclusive design principles into their development process?
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to double down on your curiosity piece, where it's honestly that, right? Yeah. So I think it's being human first, right, and being open to inclusivity, right? So similar to what I mentioned before, where we base our decisions and our solutions based on our life experiences, it's kind of flipping that narrative on the other side, where it's how could someone else view and navigate and traverse,
Right.
whether it's the website or it's a software, it's an app, or even general life
Right.
as a whole.
I think that when we're taking a look at that, the reality is that because of who we are, we're not going to see the website in the same lens as all the people that are going to be coming through to the site. And I think I'm going to answer my own question here, but I'm going to ask you about user feedback. What are your thoughts and feelings about user feedback in regards to the sites?
Yeah, I mean, it's crucial. I think a main thing that we do is we always have an accessibility statement on our site.
Yeah.
It's kind of acknowledging, like, here are the efforts and changes we are putting forward. Yeah. If for any reason you feel we're not meeting that standard, it's like, reach out to us. Like, we want to push the line forward.
Sure.
But it's kind of similar to user experience a little bit, where it's like that design feedback loop, where it's kind of understanding what the problem is and not always tackling all the symptoms that come from it, but put a solution in place, test it, and it kind of is cyclical, right? Because once you have the solution, you kind of go back to, did we solve the problem?
Right.
If we didn't, what do we got to do next? If we did, how could it be better? So it's kind of accessibility and user experience are one of those things that it doesn't end.
Yeah.
Which is not a bad thing. I think if we view it from that lens, we'll always be pushing stride forward to be human and people first.
Right. So for our viewers, Sal and I have worked together for about 5 years now, and he's been the main driving force behind accessibility within our organization from the get-go. So obviously our organization is a larger organization.
Yep.
So let's talk a little bit about training and awareness within an organization. I remember very vividly a lot of the different things that we ended up doing in our company, but what can our groups of communities or our clients be doing internally?
Yeah, so I think things that we have done that have worked really well is kind of remove the term accessibility as like a blanket statement.
Sure.
I think it plays a part and it has an impact, but it kind of makes us numb to what it actually is. So our shift and change to it has been more of like that human connection, that human touch, to make it more personal.
Sure.
And I think ways we've done that is, bringing people with actual disabilities, using actual technologies to, traverse our site to see even if our brand sites are up to the standard that we would like them to be.
Yeah.
But also the cadence of our training. So it's an ever-changing, ever-evolving, and sometimes that refresher is helpful.
Yeah.
We don't need to do it all the time, but as long as our processes and our training are pushing for a human first, a human connection, then we're able to kind of stay ahead of it.
Very cool.
Yeah.
I remember when, in the infancy of chatting about accessibility in the sites, we had two gentlemen present to our organization.
Yeah.
One was visually impaired, and talking about accessibility and different plugins and things.
Yeah.
I don't even know if it's plugins, but screen readers,
things
like that. So I can tell you from my perspective, like that was so evident, and it almost felt like it took forever.
Yeah, and I think something worth knowing or doubling down on that a little bit is we always go to like the extremes of accessibility, where it's like complete blindness or complete hearing impairment. Yeah. But sometimes it's as simple as like you broke your arm snowboarding, and that means the use of your keyboard is minimal, if not non-existent, right? Yeah. So the ability to navigate and traverse the site through the tap feature on your keyboard is a seemingly simple but great example.
Very cool.
Yeah.
So let's talk about effective strategies for raising awareness about the importance of accessibility within the organization. I think we pretty much hit on that, like just constantly pushing and making sure that everybody is hearing, but what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so kind of goes back to the research aspect, right? Yeah. So technology is constantly changing. The mediums in which we access that technologies are changing as well.
Yeah.
So it's understanding that just because it was good 2 or 3 years ago doesn't mean that it's still good anymore.
Right.
So it's continuously pushing that line forward. And the only way to do that is to kind of stay on top of it. There are a ton of podcasts and training material. Like you go to WCAG site itself, it's very technical, but it exists. Same with ADA. But there's also a lot of third-party training material that exists online to help push the bar forward.
Okay, very cool. Let's talk about the future. Let's talk about emerging technologies and other things. What, if any, are there emerging technologies, emerging trends that you're seeing that are going to potentially have a negative impact, a positive impact? Like what are you seeing?
Yeah, I mean, technology is constantly changing, and I think we just have to do our best to make sure we're keeping up with it.
Yeah.
It's hard to know what's coming down the pipe in terms of like technology that could exist. But I do know we're definitely going to a world where we're using a lot more touch screens, right? Less tactile buttons.
Yeah.
VR is becoming a thing. I don't know how that plays an impact into the digital world, but
I'm sure it will.
I'm sure it will.
Yeah.
Right. So it's understanding that those things are on the horizon and how they could play an impact and how inclusive our products and processes can be.
Yeah, absolutely. You had just briefly talked about a couple of different resources, recommendations, different things like that. I believe you mentioned ADA. What other resources, recommendations can you make for our viewers?
Yeah, I can give you a couple, but I think the main one that stands out to me, it's called the Ally Project. So it's like D and then A11Y Project.
Sorry, say that again.
So D, like THE, A11Y.
Okay,
project.
The A11Y project also will be in our comments.
Yeah, I know the URL is a little weird.
Yeah.
But they provide great training and examples on how to A, explain what it is, and B, how to apply it. Right. So I think when we're looking at like the WCAG and ADA site, it's very like, this is what you do, but it doesn't always tell you how to do it. These podcasts and sites help us bridge that gap.
Okay, very, very cool. Sal, thank you so much for taking the time. I know you got a very busy schedule, but this is something that's going to be very valuable, I believe, for all of our viewers. And so thank you so much. So to everybody, thank you for joining Cup of Joe. Like, subscribe, do all the things. And if you do have questions for our team, feel free to reach out. You can reach out directly at info@citizen55.com or 403-903-3703. Thank you so much. That's the